Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with season 10, episode 7 of our hopefully now weekly Q&A video / podcast. If you're on YouTube, links in the description to access this on some major podcasting platforms. And
before we get to questions, I just want to point out, so it's been from November to now is what? 9 months.
Yeah.
Just over 9 months. And for all the different characters that we've gone back into the challenge to play, to make them the star, and I guess for most characters, being the star means doing the most damage, because there's a few, I think maybe a handful, that they don't need to do the most damage, where you get the most out of them. And I'm thinking of Red Lantern Hal Jordan specifically, where he is probably one of the best secondary characters if you need somebody to strip all the gears off the opponent, right? Whether it's
Makes
a low
sense.
damage guy or an Astro Harness guy.
So they're high utility, even if they're low damage.
Right. But Martian Manhunter is the absolute worst. That there was just no redeeming value after playing with him. I think that's the only character where my opinion dropped after playing with him. So, other characters I might have a neutral opinion. I might not think of them very favorably, but there's usually something that comes out of it that makes me think, oh, that's interesting. I did not realize that. I thought that's good. Not at all with Martian Manhunter. What was worse was, all right, so I already knew his damage, his attack stat was low, his health was high. I already knew that his passive was pretty awful, that even the damage over time stuff did less damage than if he just finished his combo enter.
Yeah.
What I didn't realize is that the timing on his special 2 was so bad that even though the animation for the third move looks like, or the third part of his special 2 looks like it should hit, even if the second part knocks out an opponent, the third part should hit the next opponent because there's such a long pause and such a long windup, and it doesn't. And on top of that, because it's not ranged, the first 2 hits are ranged, the third one is not, there's a strong possibility that when you give him damage over time gear, it won't trigger because the third hit doesn't make contact.
Yeah.
That is so bad.
Stinks.
It really does. So I can't, I feel like it was, it'll be relevant later when we talk about, if we get around to that question about tiers, but in my mind, there's sort of, now, there used to be just secret S tiers where people underappreciated really good characters, right?
Yeah.
So under the radar.
Especially in, certain contexts, right? Maybe not by themselves, but, in some contexts, they really shined.
Right. So in my mind, it feels like Martian Manhunter is like an extra lower tier. Like he's extra bad.
He's like an F tier or sub F, unusable.
Right. And that's not entirely fair because the real unusable, there's only one answer for the real unusable character.
Yeah.
And that's Suicide Squad Joker Unhinged. I don't think there's anybody worse than that. I don't care how high you make his stats. The fact that when he knocks somebody out, he tops the stats of somebody worse.
Yeah.
Makes him really bad. But
it's like wasting time.
Yeah, it's just it's funny that it's taken this long. I guess it was partly coincidence of the time that we picked to start our challenge sort of exploration.
Yeah, so we're ending on kind of a low note, relatively speaking.
Yeah, so it's towards the tail end that it took us this long to find something that was not good, but I think I've been playing around with Godfall Superman already, and there's definitely some interesting things that I like about him more than I thought I would, and not in a way that I expected. And I think Regime Hawker at least has the potential. She's going to be the sort of last one before we fill in the gaps. And nobody's responded. Nobody's told us how they want us to fill in the gaps, whether they want us to wait for the characters to roll around again, or whether they want us to just get on with it. But Regime Hawkgirl has that special 2 that auto crits if you hit 200%. And from what I remember, the circle disappears really fast for that particular mini game.
Yeah.
But because you can usually guess it as long as you're prepared and you start tapping right away, it's not too hard to get 200% and get the bonus from her passive. So I like that we're going to still end on, the characters are coming up. It's just, if they are worse than I expect, I think it'll be as much of a surprise as Martian Manhunter, because Martian Manhunter, after how many months, that was a surprise. Yeah.
Okay. And I think we can maybe spend a minute talking about it, just because we just finished season 3 of Ted Lasso.
Oh my god, Ted Lasso.
Season. Very good. Solid. I think it was a show that remained relatively consistent throughout. I felt like it was the right time to end it. It's hard because it's been so long since I've watched the previous seasons, but I felt like the third season was about as good as the previous seasons. Maybe like not quite as good, just because it's, you know, you kind of know what to expect. It's like more of the same, right? Where getting the same thing for 3 seasons in a row, or not the same, but like similar, right? Has to sort of naturally go a little bit stale over time. But I don't think it like hit mediocre, right? I think it stayed as like really strong all throughout, and it probably was like a similar sort of overall quality, even if my enjoyment of it maybe lessened a little bit. So I think what that means is that it was they ended at the right time, they ended strong, and it was a solid show.
Yeah. So I should have prepared, because as soon as you said that, it made me think of some of the history of TV shows. And what's interesting is, what popped in my head when we were talking about that is that modern TV shows are much more likely to have long story arcs.
Yeah.
Where the previous episodes matter.
Yeah, instead of like that more episodic stuff.
Well, yeah, so there's not a lot of investment. So if there is kind of any, I guess, change in the character, it's not that they change fundamentally in any way. There's nothing sort of life-changing about what happens to them, but stuff happens, and it's most of the time if something significant happens, it resets before the end of the episode, and then it just gives them a little bit more depth and richness that you're aware of if you've seen the episode, but not like anything that you need to know. You know, like the classic to me is CSI. Yeah. Like those procedural police shows or Law and Order, where none of the previous episodes' plot matters at all.
Yes. It's interesting. A show that did a pretty good job of sort of balancing factors was Poker Face recently. Ryan Johnson. It's that Natasha Lyonne mystery one where they've made it very episodic. There's little things that carry over from episode to episode where you don't need to know them. You could get like a 1-sentence summary and be fine. But you have a little bit more appreciation for sort of the context. So she'll you know, have different knowledge or comport herself slightly differently, but you know, you don't notice it unless you've already watched it, right? It's kind of like how Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, how you never watched Breaking Bad, but you still liked Better Call Saul a lot, where there's little things that you know if you've watched Breaking Bad, but you don't miss it. You don't know you're missing something unless you have the knowledge to actually not be missing anything.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess, and the other point I was going to make about the history of it is that we almost take it for granted actually now that the default for a lot of shows is that there's a longer story arc, that you can enjoy each episode, but then there's a bigger picture that comes into it that just makes it so much more enjoyable, like little layers that end up getting peeled back. And I think what's neat about Ted Lasso is it gets the benefit of that. And I think you probably could have made one of those episodic shows where not much changes and not much happens.
Out of Ted Lasso, you mean?
I think so. Only because there's just so much going on. Like there's so many characters, right? Yeah. And there's the potential for that kind of story, but you would lose out on so much of what makes Ted Lasso really good. Yeah. It's especially, I was thinking when I was watching Ted Lasso that there's stuff in it in the last season, like Sherlock, I think was it the 3rd season, where a lot of the characters, they have these story arcs where it not only just pays off near the end, but it's almost like it's a tribute. Yeah. That's not the right word. Where they've earned a closeness. Yeah. And that they take advantage of that in a way, but not like badly, but they take advantage of it. They use that closeness. Leverage it. They leverage it to make a better story because of it. It's because you know them that it makes those stories more meaningful. Yeah. So in the example of Sherlock was that episode where, it's not a huge spoiler, right? Watson gets married. Yeah. And there's these little moments I think, oh my God. And I feel like they wouldn't have hit nearly as hard if it weren't for the history. I mean, they're still good. Yeah. But you see those threads.
You care more for that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the problem that you always run into with stuff like that is you there's like a payoff of getting to know a character and having a character established.
Right.
And then there's the fine line between paying off that character, like paying off like the pre-established sort of tropes and expectations for that character, especially sometimes like Ken's character, right, starts off very sort of grisly and prickly and like not in touch with emotions at all,
and he still is prickly.
He still is prickly, and I think that's Ted Lasso is an example of it by and large working, right, where you can have things that are a little unexpected for him, but still work with the character, because as you understand him more richly, he can be a less two-dimensional character. You can have moments that, you know, are a little bit more vulnerable, or even seem a little bit more vulnerable, seem out of character, and you can contextualize those. And then there's like less successful examples, I think, where that sort of characterization becomes increasingly one note. It's the whole idea of Flanderization.
Ned Flanders from Simpsons?
Yeah, that's where it comes from, where his character started more nuanced and rich and became compressed into the things he was best known for over the course of seasons.
Like Kramer
on
Seinfeld. He became the buffoon that did his little shtick when he just, you know, slides in the room and he does that little sort of twitching stuff and whatever.
And like for me, which is it's an unfortunate one, but I think that kind of happened a little bit for me with Holt in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where eventually his whole kind of shtick and characterization went so deep into this like deeply like out of touch guy with like anything, where he was like really sort of like snooty and like almost, I would say, like out of touch. And it became this really sort of not like incoherent exactly, but not internally consistent characterization compared to where he was earlier in the season. And so I think what's good about Ted Lasso is it doesn't fall into that trap. It manages to keep people sort of complex. It keeps its rich characterization of people, I think, pretty well through to the end. And people either get more complex and nuanced or stay the same.
I think a lot of that might have to do with how good you are at planning ahead of time, because the longer your show runs, the more you maybe paint yourself into corners. The fact that Ted Lasso was only 3 seasons gives you a better chance, so that the stuff you picked for them at the beginning still offers you enough so you can work with it, right? Because if you start off in a way and you realize, oh, that's not the direction I wanted to go, then you almost have to do something to make them a bit more interesting and relevant still. That's
fair. I think maybe the only character that I have a little bit of that feeling with is Coach Beard, potentially, where he just felt like he got weirder and weirder, but I'm a lot more willing to sort of accept that as just being more sort of comfortable in the space that he was in.
Can I tell you, I really strongly disagree with that, because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't watched it, because it is a wonderful show. If you're going to get a chance to watch it, watch it.
Oh, but you think that there's that emotional moment that you understand him better?
Yes, there's a moment where he's not just the weird guy.
Yeah.
You see why he's so conflicted and why he's so a little bit wild, and that it's a manifestation of what he was before and how he's able to control it in a way so that he can still be Ted's friend.
Yeah, I mean, I like that moment in the show. I just think that you know, it's not necessarily a payoff for the rest of it, and he is just kind of like almost a little too weird. Like he keeps getting ratcheted up, and it's not even like that too weird is like a problem. It's more just that it felt like they kept upping the ante by making him weirder, you know? Whereas if he like started somewhere, I would be more okay with him staying there. But it feels like a sort of character shift almost.
It's to me, it's interesting because maybe it's the kind of characters that I find interesting, because there's almost a self-destructiveness to Coach Beard in some of the stuff that he does.
For sure.
And I feel like we get some insight into that in the 3rd episode in a way that's...
3rd season?
Sorry, the 3rd season that's really surprising, but in a way that's consistent with how he's been, and why I feel like, if anything, it's sort of it's the reverse kind of thing, where it's not really so much a payoff, because if you've done it the other way around, it's a reveal as opposed to payoff, and the other characters more get like payoffs, and he gets that kind of reveal. And I thought that was actually kind of a neat contrast to what was happening.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you that I like that moment a lot, and I think overall it's a good show. I think it's telling that we have not that many sort of nitpicks about it, and the sort of issues that we do have, we don't agree on necessarily. It's
It tells me that they did a lot of stuff right, because you can't make everybody happy, and if there's something that made both of us unhappy, then it would feel like more of a misstep.
Mm-hmm. It's a larger sample size at least, and for what it's worth, I've heard that Jason Sudeikis was really sort of careful and took like a long time, like maybe too long, like writing, rewriting, and plotting all of the third season stuff out, and that's one of the reasons why the show was like delayed a couple times. But
I think it was worth it. Sometimes you can only be late once, but you can be awful forever.
That's true. Once it's out, it's out.
Yeah.
So anyways, moving on to the first question of the week, or first comment. This one comes from K31Wiz, so Mark, and I'm going to skip around a little bit here and just read bits and pieces because it's quite a long comment.
The important part I think you want to not miss is that UPD, that we couldn't figure out what it was an abbreviation for updated.
Yeah, which Mark thought was a commonly used thing, which I don't know if we're not sort of as plugged into culture, or if it's a different space, or I don't know who's wrong.
I know I'm definitely not plugged in. Like, to me, I don't know if people get a sense of this or not. I don't play a lot of games.
Yeah.
I do very little gaming at all, whether it's mobile or otherwise. Mm-hmm. So the fact that I have any expertise in any game is sort of funny and unusual.
But Mark said, on the topic of my channel, you probably won't understand much as I'm not a native English speaker, and I'm not sure if default subtitles are good enough. And I realized this going to Mark's channel and finding it all not in English. I believe it's in Russian. And I was like, oh yeah, this is...
So do you recognize the Russian sounds, or is it because the symbols were Cyrillic?
I think it was in Cyrillic, and it was the mix of Mark's name and the accent, and like it's just my guess.
Right.
Might be wrong. But then Mark says, I've reached out to the guys at the IGAU podcast, and we did an episode with them, which was a cool experience. I talked some things there and explained my view on the game. And so that's interesting. I didn't even know there was an Injustice podcast.
Me neither.
This is the first I'm hearing of it. Other than ours, which is not really an Injustice podcast. It's a podcast that talks about Injustice stuff a decent amount. And then he says, the one thing universal to all languages, though, the thumbnails are cool and goofy. I really enjoy making them. And I checked out the channel, and Mark's thumbnails are actually very good. They're a lot better than ours. They're pretty fun and engaging.
Well, ours are aggressively plain.
Yeah, that's true.
That's our aesthetic.
And so then I will read maybe some of this next bit, which is, as I understand it, the same developers are working on Mortal Kombat Mobile and the original Injustice, so they probably have people that would be able to update the game, but they're not encouraged to do so. If money they make from selling paid packs is enough to pay for their servers or whatever is there to maintain, they don't have to shut the game down. I haven't played Mortal Kombat Mobile, but people I talked to said that it's very similar to Injustice Gods Among Us. They keep adding updates, and they keep the game more relevant. When I asked people why they think Injustice is losing its player base, the answer was no updates, no new characters, which is fair in some sense. People saw many updates and new characters / gears when the game was at its peak, so they expect more. And then I'll skip a little bit. Talking about hackers, Mark says, they skipped the entire part that would have made them appreciate the characters and gears, and I see this as a big reason why the game is dying.
Okay, I want to add, I agree with that. I want to add something that's seems significant to me. Is not just that they would appreciate it more, they would have a better sense of how things work, so they could make decisions about what to use. So what's it doesn't really drive me crazy. What's the word? I find it sort of funny and annoying that so many of the questions are from people who've hacked the game and say, well, I've got all this stuff. Which should I do? What should I put together? How do I make a team? Seriously, that's probably the best indicator that they haven't played the game, whether they hacked it themselves or they've gotten somebody else's account, that because they have just no insight in how the characters work, because they never played them to get them to where they are.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can end up with like a smattering of gold characters,
right,
and not be exactly sure. But I think a lot of times, especially because you have to play them so much to get the XP, that the real knowledge gap comes if you haven't brought them into online multiplayer yet.
Right.
And so you've just been caring about the stats, and then suddenly you have to care about sort of matchups and synergies and other factors separate from just how big they are.
Right.
And so I think there's a time where you have that sort of gap. But I think... So it's not that there's no questions like that I think are reasonable, but there's a certain type of question where it's like, I have everything, I don't know anything that's good.
I know. Yes, exactly.
Which just clearly, it's like the sliding scale of like, I have figured it all out myself to I need everything figured out for me. And at the point where you have everything in the game, there's no way that you haven't gotten more figured out.
And that brings us to the next kind of annoying argument is always that, listen, I don't need to know for sure that somebody's hacked the game. Yeah. I mean, chances are we're not going to be able to figure it out. But when you've got that sort of contrast in the same person, I can be pretty confident.
You just like vibe checking them. You're like, on principle, I'm going to say that you're a hacker because
I'm saying you didn't earn any of what you had. And whether that's hacking or you just took somebody else's account, I don't know that there's any difference.
Yeah. And so I think the other thing that's a little bit interesting in Mark's comment here is the idea of like it being the same team. Because I think internal, like within studios, right? This is done by NetherRealm and published by Warner Brothers. There's certainly some amount of manpower that they dedicated to the Injustice in its heyday and whatever games they're updating now. But it's really hard to say. I think it's also probably relatively likely that they have like a mobile development team, right? Just because it seems like it's broadly speaking a different thing. You're developing it in different languages. It's for like iOS and Android, so it's not like the same process. But within that, it's so hard to say what a team even means, right? Like, for the work that it is, unfortunately, this doesn't seem like the kind of thing that's going to be somebody's like passion project, Right. Just because it's like a spin-off, and I think the like initial game itself is a lot funded probably out of like a marketing budget for these games, right? As a companion piece to help draw attention to them.
I think that's what it was. That's how it was it was pushed that way.
Yeah.
At least Injustice Gods Among Us was.
Yeah.
Right? So they to encourage people to, hey, download this because you can get more features on the console.
Yeah. And then maybe I think potentially there's been a shift towards understanding the value in mobile games and that free-to-play space and sort of like selling packs and all of those in-app purchases and everything. But, it's really hard to know if there's like a consistent number of people working on this, if it's a thing that they contract out, right? Whether it's related to the actual console game and the developers and the team on that, right? Especially because it seems like there's some amount of like asset sharing and sort of cross-pollination between the two.
But even on top of that, they're both different licenses. So you'd have to, even if somebody's got the technical skill to handle the game, you'd have to find somebody, if you're going to pull somebody from the Mortal Kombat team, they have to be interested in the DC universe enough to be able to come up with skins.
To do the work. And I think
artistically, right? Like, do they know the characters? Do they know anybody that they could pull in from one of the stories? They have to have at least a little bit of facility with the other universe.
And I'm not even sure that that's true, because the other thing that I was going to say is that, like, the way that we're talking about it is almost assuming an amount of free reign that the developers or the team have to work on the project, one project or the other, where I think a lot of this is probably largely based off of some amount of higher up in a team like NetherRealm and in a for like a publisher like Warner Brothers, right? It seems relatively unlikely that people have sort of degree of self-determinism to choose what project they want to work on and what they want to do. So I think whether or not, like, how large the team is a real question for me, because if you're just talking about like models and all that stuff, there's a chance that you pull somebody from another project very briefly and give them a very sort of specific goal, and there's a chance that you just get like contractor work to do that stuff, right? So I think the way that, and this is the way that I often think about it too, but the idea that there's sort of like an internal team working on just this one thing, I think is maybe misses the reality of how these teams work. And unfortunately, I think for a game like this, I know we were hopeful for a long time, but with hindsight, I think like the second that a game like this stops getting like updates for any significant length of time, it's very likely that whoever is a higher up, right, like NetherRealm or Warner Brothers, whoever can pull the plug, has essentially put it into holding pattern and like shuttered the actual, like, most of the workforce on it.
I think that's true too. I just think there's just so many factors that are working against the idea that there's going to be any more updates.
Yeah.
I mean, for sure, like if you don't have the resources, if the sort of mission of the team does not involve updating Injustice.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But even if they did, I think the fact is that it's the same way that they had WWE Immortals had the same, I guess, NetherRealm Studios working on it. They had the same gameplay. They had the same idea. A lot of it was very similar, right? With the gears and the teams and the kind of... But, if you don't know WWE, I don't know that you can just jump from one area to another to make a new skin. Because what are the updates that really matter? I don't know that anybody really cares about some gameplay that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
Right? They're not imagining that the next breakthrough or the next multiplayer or the next whatever.
Yeah, you're just putting in new characters,
right.
Just filling out content, characters, gears.
But I feel like that the cheapest, not the cheapest, but the easiest way to have new content is just new characters.
Yeah.
A lot of the mechanics are already there. You just need to do some graphics, make a few creative choices about the specials.
Mm-hmm.
And that part is where I think you still need, on top of some sort of corporate will, you need somebody with some expertise. Otherwise, I mean, are they just going to make like 5 more Batman skins and 5 more Superman skins?
Yeah, that's true. No, that's a good point. There needs to be at least some amount of knowledge of the game. I just think we've seen a lot with like TV and movies, right? Very recently, how executives have the power to do a huge amount of reshaping of the internal structure of studios, about how a lot of stuff works, how things get released. And I think by and large, it's a similar-ish process in gaming, where as much as we would hope that, if enough packs get bought, that somebody over at the studio goes, oh, look, guys, there's enough money here. We can start putting sort of time back into it. I think it's very likely that the call comes from somebody...
From a suit.
Who is not really in a position to notice or care about anything other than like a massive uptick in like value.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that there's a writer that I follow online, Mark Evanier.
Yeah.
And he talks, I think it was him that talked a little bit about that, how, because he's been involved in writing comics, TV shows, maybe movies too, and how the creatives have an idea.
Yeah.
And then the studio heads, who aren't really the creatives, they're just, management and money bags.
Yeah.
But they feel like they have to impose something on them to show that their touch actually means something more than just
to prove their value.
Right.
It's like it's proof of work. It's like I'm doing something.
Yeah. So they'll have notes, and they'll give notes to the creatives to make changes that a lot of times make no sense, don't serve the story, don't serve whatever it is, but they do it because they can.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess that's the same point that you were making about how people just like there's
an additional anecdote there.
Yeah.
Anyways, do we want to do one more question, or do we think that that's
maybe one more quick one? I think maybe one more quick one.
So this one comes from Ricardo.canoe928, and it's CANOO, not OE like the watercraft.
Oh, right.
Before I get the question, this is funny. I read this somewhere, and I would need to re-verify the statistic, but apparently drunk canoeing is the most unsafe activity by distance traveled compared to everything else. So there's like drunk driving, drunk walking, drunk whatever, and it's just because it's a lot easier to die by drowning than it is to die by like walking and like stumbling into the road or something else.
And you go slow.
Right. So for every kilometer that you travel, or I guess mile if you're in the US, you're traveling not that much faster than like a jog, right? Maybe a decent amount, but whatever. And there's a lot more danger. And that's not to say that you should, drunk drive instead of drunk canoe, or drunk drive instead of drunk walk, because obviously the factor that also matters, and matters a lot, is how dangerous you are to other people, right? Drunk walking is a little more dangerous than drunk driving, but it's only dangerous to yourself. You're very unlikely to, stumble and kill somebody else. Right. And the real safe activity is actually like drunk, like riding in a taxi. Because that's exactly as safe as sober riding in a taxi or riding in a car.
So the first time I saw anything relevant to that was in Freakonomics, where they first talked about how drunk walking is more dangerous per kilometer.
Yeah.
But I think that's also a function of statistics and how you look at stuff, because in terms of danger per kilometer, sure, because you just travel faster in a car.
Yeah.
And so you make up more kilometers quickly.
Yeah.
to balance out against the people who are getting into accidents, even if they're hurting other people.
Yeah, on that half an hour drive,
Right.
You have like half an hour to make a mistake versus that like the
Right.
same amount of time walking is probably like at least an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours walking.
Right, so you've touched on the fact that it's more dangerous to other people. I think because you're at higher speeds and there's just more mass involved, it's also more fatal to you.
Yeah.
And if we were to treat it as danger during time spent in the activity,
Yeah.
I think you would lose some of that. Drunk walking would lose some of that relative danger, because you might spend a lot of time, but you're not going very far, and it stretches out sort of the denominator that you're using.
And I think the other thing is that a lot of times when people are walking, they're relatively close to their destination.
Right.
So I think if you're like going from like a bar or a party home, you know, I think a lot of people, if you're like really, really drunk and out of it, you're more likely to make that decision if you're like super close to walk.
Right.
Whereas if you're that drunk and out of it, you might, you know, not make the decision to drive. So I think drunk walking maybe selects for people who are potentially drunker even.
True.
Because you're like, you know, you have to be like really close. You're
Well,
like, it's 5 minutes. What are you going to do? How else are you going to get home?
There's no mothers against drunk walking.
Yeah.
So there's no kind
Stigma
of peer
either.
pressure.
Yeah,
There's no
that's
stigma
true.
associated with it.
That's true.
Yeah.
Anyways, Ricardo Canoe says, how do I get better gear or nth to upgrade my metal character? It takes so long, bro.
Right. I mean, the first question is easier. How do you get better gear? There's two parts. Buy gear lockers.
Yeah.
Even if you don't want any of the gears, even if you only want the legendary gears, even if you only want the ones that you can get from Survivor, when you get gears from the gear locker, they will give you shards so you can fuse the gears that you want.
Yeah.
And if you get so there's a balance, right? Because you get more shards from the higher level gears.
Yeah.
But you get more shards
From upgraded gears.
From upgraded gears.
Yeah.
So based on the math, it does not take you very long to extract the benefit if you were to fuse all the little tiny gears that you don't want.
Yeah.
Because of two things. One, it's easy to fuse. You max them out. That investment pays off after, I think, 6 shatters. Like if you shattered it like 6 or 7 times or something, you will end up with more. You will end up ahead in shards if you've max promoted it or max fused it first.
Yeah.
And the second thing is those lower level gears, you are just more likely to get them in a pack.
Mm-hmm.
So then not only will they pay off better, those are the gears that you get most often anyways.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So that's the only real thing. Because the implied sort of question here is with that it takes so long is how do I do it faster?
Right.
And that would be the way of getting sort of resources to upgrade your gear faster.
Right.
That might not be intuitive, right? That you might not guess.
Right.
And unfortunately, I don't think there's much else in terms of like a trick, right? You see it and you go, oh my god, this is going to take so long. And
it does.
It does. There's no real sort of shortcut. I think
there used to be.
Yeah, there did, but the only real sort of getting it fast is finding a way of getting credits faster, in my opinion.
Right.
Because I don't think Survivor is a particularly efficient way of farming. I don't think online is efficient way of farming.
Because you've got more control over it. Like, you can farm credits as much as you want. You can't farm multiplayer the same way.
No.
Without spending a lot of recharges.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, it's a resource. Power credits are a resource that are well within everybody's grasp, and it's just a matter of how much time you're willing to put into it.
Yeah. So it really the answer is grind power credits as fast as you can, and then shatter and fuse your low tier gear.
Right.
Yeah.
Nth metal is more difficult. Maybe that we'll save for another time.
Okay.
It does take a long time.
Yeah.
So it's that funny that comment. It takes so long, bro.
And unfortunately,
that I think that's the point of the game.
You're searching for a speed up strat that maybe isn't there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to finish up, we'd like to thank some people. I'd like to give a shout out to Eliza Vestigial Caton. This section has been here for a while, and I don't want to get rid of it. But the purpose that it sort of originally served is not being fully met. With how busy I was over the summer, I didn't really have much chance to socialize with people. Right. So I haven't talked to Eliza in a while, so I don't have anything to pull from for a little joke here. Right. And the idea of the sort of patronage also doesn't make that much sense because obviously she hasn't been giving me anything either. So there's sort of neither halves of this.
That's very transactional.
But it was for the joke, right? It could be very rarely. It didn't have to be like an ongoing thing,
right?
But just no part of what makes this work has happened recently. So I'm calling it vestigial this week. because
like an appendix.
Yeah, because I'm stretching, I'm grasping at straws to find something, and right now it feels accurate. But maybe the purpose of this is to remind me to actually hang out with Eliza at some point soonish, so that I can, not just for bits again. When I say it like that, it sounds like I'm just farming it for content for this, but it's not content for anybody. It's not like we're making good money off this section of the video.
Right.
But it'll be my reminder. And we'd also like to give a huge thank you to all of our lovely supporters on Patreon.
And that would be Alexis M supporting us on the Your Message Here tier, Michael Devries, Irvin, Ruiz, Hoshi 127, who are supporting us on the credited level, and the number of people whose names you're seeing on the screen who have been generous enough to have supported us at some point through our Patreon during this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much for your support, and thanks so much to all of you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.